Hello, this is Kip Krill with Standpoint. Thank you for your interest in our presentation regarding observational research, or more commonly called ethnography. And as the title suggests, it is very much a journey in your consumer or your customer or your end user's shoes. And my goal with this presentation is to share with you some best practices as it regards to doing ethnography. On this next slide was study results that were collected by StageGate International. And as many of you know, StageGate is a decision-making methodology that is widely used in the product development field. And in the study conducted by StageGate, they went out and asked innovation leaders across the country to evaluate different sources of ideas that are coming into their company. And they broke those methods down into three buckets, those being voice of customer techniques, open innovation, and other methods. And the sort of main conclusion of this slide is that in terms of effectiveness, the voice of customer techniques like visit teams and focus groups and co-creation, enthusiast communities, these are rated very highly when compared to some of the other sources of ideas. Most notably is ethnography. Of all of the VOC techniques that you see there labeled in red, ethnography was rated the most effective. Not as extensively used, probably for a couple of reasons. One, they can be very difficult to organize. They can also be a costly technique, and it's not the most speedy technique either. It does take coordination times and takes execution time. But for those companies that do embark on an ethnography, it's a very, very good technique, worth the time and worth the investment, particularly in your front end of innovation efforts, and particularly if your pipeline is pretty thin. One of the other ways that we look at VOC methods is, and this is not an exhaustive list of all the VOC methods, but one of the ways to evaluate and understand the upsides and downsides of various VOC methods is we often use this 2x2 matrix here, where we take each of the methods and we categorize them based on whether they are a qualitative or a quantitative methodology. And qualitative is, more about understanding the factors, right, around a person's decision making. Quantitative are measurement techniques, right? You tend to survey a lot more people and are able to collapse the results down into summary statistics. One of the other big ways to categorize VOC methods is whether or not they are more of an attitudinal versus a behavioral methodology. And attitudinal methodologies are very common, and I think that that's really important to understand, is that things like focus groups or in-depth interviews, or if you have an enthusiast community, these are methods only to measure what we call POBAs, which are perceptions, opinions, beliefs, and attitudes. Above that center line there on the qualitative domain, these are methods that we use to actually observe or to understand people's behavior. And ethnography is right up there. Is that because we are doing observations in that person's environment, we can pick up on behaviors that often are not articulated. In fact, people oftentimes exhibit behaviors that they're not even aware of, or they may have developed workarounds to a pain point. They're things that are habitual for that end user or for that customer that it would be very, very difficult to have them articulate in more of a traditional setting like a focus group. So for that reason that it measures behavior is why it is so effective. And we often use ethnography for what we call, or identifying what we call those unarticulated needs, which I just described. So in think the other thing to note is that the quest should always be, depending on, again, your needs and budget and timing, to understand people's behaviors, because there often is a disconnect between what people actually do, their behavior, and what people actually say. Now, attitudes can be a factor that leads to a person's behavior, but they are not always predictive of a person's behavior. So when you have the opportunity to employ more of a behavioral VOC technique, our recommendation is always to do that. So as it relates to ethnography, it really kind of involves sort of four things. One of those is, as we've alluded to before, is observing. Actually try to observe people in a natural environment, natural habitat. It does involve some interviewing and some one-on-one dialogue between the ethnography team and the study participant. Artifacts, so there are things that people are going to use at work, or things that are important as part of their habit. It could be paperwork, it could be anything that that person is using that they're willing to give you examples of is an important part of the ethnography experience. And when you can, you want to participate. One of the most successful ethnographies that I've personally been involved in is where we actually helped housekeepers in hotel rooms actually clean for a couple of days. And we actually job shadowed them and went around with them to clean hotel rooms. And it was a great way for us to understand where there might be some pain points, some unarticulated needs, or some ways that we could improve productivity. So as I said before, the advantages of ethnography is, again, great method to observe behaviors, and again, identify those unmet or unarticulated needs. Again, disadvantages, they can be time-consuming. It can be an expensive type of methodology, and it's not going to be conducive to all settings, right? I mean, for lack of a better example, it may be kind of hard to get an ethnography team to go in and observe people in a nuclear power plant, right, or where safety might be an issue. The format, direct is typically the most common, where you actually staff observers, but indirect, where you would actually put some unmanned video in that habitat and go back and review the footage is certainly an option. And then there are hybrids along those ways, where you can get both, basically some observation and just also some participant-generated content as well. Observational skills are really, really needed. And not everybody is great at this. On your ethnography team, you definitely want people that have very, very high situational awareness, and then of secondary importance is active listening and a very non-obtrusive personality, and the ability to distill information into needs or those headline ideas. But absolutely at the top of the list is situational awareness, very good observational skills. So when assembling a team to do ethnography, there are ways to test people for these skills. You definitely want to make sure that you have that represented on the team. And the good thing about ethnography is that it is highly effective in both business to business and also business to consumer. So some of the things that you look for when you're doing an ethnography is you want to look for certain behaviors. And kind of things that we look for here are sort of misuse of a product, or if there's any kind of inefficiencies in a person carrying out a task. Is there any waste? Has the study participant developed some kind of compensatory behavior or workaround? Or any kind of kitchen table solutions. So the three images below are very, very good examples of some kitchen table solutions that actually became some great insight for product development for one of our clients. The picture at the far left, we were in India, and we were doing observation on a construction site. It was very, very rainy, and if you notice that that worker had taken pieces of plastic and created a cape that actually was secured by the helmet, and then there was another piece of plastic at the person's waist. And we saw multiple workers doing this, and what we learned is that they were developing some solutions to keep water from getting down their shirt or down their pants while they were on the job site. So this was probably not something that would have come out of a focus group, but it certainly identified a pain point or a need for workers. And that insight, that observation was carried forth into some innovation exercises. The middle picture and the one on the right is actually an example of misuse of a product. So this particular company manufactures these, I believe they're called N95 respirators. They're used in a lot of production facilities. And one of the things that we noticed is that this particular worker was not wearing his mask properly. The proper way to wear the mask, as you see in the picture on the far right. And we saw multiple workers doing this. Now, certainly it could have been an educational need that this staff had, but what we found is that the workers felt as though that the way that they had secured the mask was not interfering with their safety glasses, their helmet. It was a little bit more comfortable. So again, this misuse of a product was kind of again, an unarticulated pain point, unarticulated need that would have only come out of observation. And so then that insight was carried forth into some product ideation. So some best practices, probably self-evident at this point, but you do want to put a heavier emphasis on observation and participation, and you want to try to limit as much of the interviewing and dialogue as you possibly can. Because at that point, the more interviewing you do versus observation, you're blurring the lines with more traditional qualitative research, which is getting at POBAs. And most importantly is that you want the interviewing to be keyed off of a behavior. So the best way to go into an ethnography is that if you see a behavior, point it out, and then ask someone to explain why they're doing something that particular way. So in other words, why are you wearing, the mask in the way that you're wearing it? Or what are the reasons that you cut this plastic out? Call out the behavior, use that to guide your interviewing. Like any research project, you really do need to have a clear study purpose because fieldwork variables are going to overshadow your research plan if there's this is a very uncontrolled methodology. So in other words, Murphy's Law applies here. Something will go wrong because you're in a natural environment. You're in that person's domain. They're probably interrupting them at work. They'll get called to a meeting, whatever. Something will go wrong, and a great deal of flexibility is needed. We also recommend a team approach in that you have someone who is designated as your interviewer, a documenter, and an observer. So the observer, of course, is that person with high situational awareness. You've got somebody that is, focused on kind of getting through any pre-planned discussion as possible. And then because sometimes you're going to be limited with the type of documentation that you can do, you may not be able to bring in video, you may not be able to bring in audio. If that's the case, you're going to have somebody focus on that, but if you can't bring in that equipment, you really need somebody there to take as many notes as possible because it's just not cognitively possible for one or even two people to be able to do all of those things. And I know that's not ideal, It's what we always recommend. So try to push for 3 people on the team if at all possible. And if you are bringing in recording equipment, it's got to be discreet. So, you know, I've been on ethnographies where they wanted to bring literally a film crew, and you know it can be done, but it's really disruptive to the process, and so I always err to something a lot more discreet. And then you got to make sure you're there to see a range of behaviors. So like an hour may not be enough, or 2 hours may not be enough. So you want to try to work with the, you know, with the participants, or you know, with the organization that's granting you access to see, can you extend your time there 4 or 6 hours? You know, talk to somebody that's familiar with the environment and let them know that that's one of your goals, is to try to see that range of behaviors and try to be there as long as you possibly can. When we are doing ethnography and we are developing our observation guide and also our topic guide for any interviewing, we often use the Spradley framework, and this came right out of anthropology, but essentially that there are kind of 9 different factors or 9 different domains that you want to make sure that you take a look at when you are doing an observation. So you want to make sure that you really understand the space, who are the actors, who are the people that are involved in that habitat, what are the activities, the objects, the actions, any events, the sequence of events. And this is particularly important for any kind of journey work. Goals, like what are the actors attempting to accomplish, and then increasing important is whatever feelings or emotions you see in context. And again, this is where observation is really important, because I remember one specific ethnography where we were observing workers on a factory line, and we could visibly see some frustration on their face, and we had the flexibility to go over and approach those workers and say, hey, what's going on when you make that face? And we were able to understand a particular pain point in their manufacturing process. And again, that would not have come up in a traditional focus group, or any like a one-on-one interview, but we were able to visibly see a behavior and react and sort of understand immediately what was going on. Very powerful if you have the opportunity to do that. Other things that you can do when you're doing an ethnography is explore context. So just some simple things to take into account when you are developing your observation guide, but you can have people walk you around and show you the different ways they might use a certain item, for example, or you can ask them, how do you organize your workspace, or how do you organize your pantry? If you see like clusters of items, like if you go into someone's pantry and you see like, all the spices together, probe on that. Or if you see some clusters of things that maybe are not so logical, you want to probe on that. I remember early in my career, I worked on a ethnography where we went into people's pantries, and I noticed that the applesauce was on one shelf, but canned fruits were on the other. And what we found out is that separation was the concern that at that point in time, applesauce was in glass jars, and the homeowner, the consumer, was very concerned about the canned fruit breaking the glass jar with the applesauce, just normal, rustling around in the pantry. And that kind of led to an innovation around, packaging innovation around trying to put, applesauce in more of a plastic vehicles. And then again, what were you thinking when you placed these items here? Where do you keep this? Where do you store that? I noticed that you've got some of these bottles on the front of the shelf and these bottles on the back, for example. These again are things that you're looking for, but you want to understand what led to the person's behavior. So context is extremely important. The other is looking at behaviors, or kind of understanding the process. So, you can, in your topic guide, have, show me where you keep your reference materials. Walk me through the process of finding the office supplies you use, for example, or just the supplies that you need for this particular task. I want to watch you do a load of laundry and how you, explain each step. One thing we always encourage when you're doing ethnography is follow people before, during, and after. So, for example, if the subject was around laundry, look at the activities prior to just leading up to the laundry and the activities following the laundry, because sometimes there could be an innovation in that before, during, and after ecosystem that could be really meaningful. And oftentimes we only want to just focus on the during, but look at the before, during, and after, because you're going to find some innovation opportunities in that customer journey. Using the product we've provided you, you go ahead and, make yourself a snack. Have them watch using your product in their environment. Or, demonstrate, again, a B2B example, but demonstrate the aspects of metal stamping you hate the most, right? It's okay to be provocative here with these questions, because there's going to be some aspect that they dislike the most. And again, you might have to prompt them to think about it, because with metal stamping, their day-to-day activities probably have become so habitual that you might have to prompt them with an emotion to get them to think about it, and then to kind of call up, like, now that I walk through this, yes, this step is the one that I hate the most, right? So it's okay to be slightly leading or slightly provocative in these environments, particularly when you're trying to tease out some kind of behavior or something that's hinged to an emotion. The default, right, in business communication is always to be super formal and not to be emotive. So in these conversations, sometimes you have to prompt the emotion and just check in and say, hey, I can imagine that's frustrating. Is that right? Did I get it right? And then give them the opportunity to sort of correct you, or to make sure that you kind of listened and understood. The other thing you want to do in ethnography is also respond to any language inconsistencies. So these are some examples that came out of past projects that I've been involved in, but here, again, that active listening and that observation are really, really important. But you can imagine these actually being real live scenarios. So one, during an ethnography, you said, hey, you keep all your cleaning supplies in the pantry, but I see a mop and a broom over here, and the vacuum is over here. Is that typically where you keep it? So help me understand, when you say you keep all of your cleaning supplies in your pantry, help me understand, do you not consider these cleaning supplies, or what's the reasons that you've broken them up? So sometimes you are getting that granular. I remember the very first ethnography that I did, probably 30 years ago, was in the Deep South, and we were in people's homes, and they kept calling all of the cleaning products Pine Sol, but they were actually using something else, like Mr. Clean, and it just dawned on me that in the deep, deep South is that Pine Sol is kind of the handle for all cleaning products. It's kind of like Jell-O, that a lot of people, depending on where you are, is that regardless of the cleaning product, it's Pine Sol. And this happens all the time. You'll go into somebody's home. They might even screened into a study saying that they use generic toilet paper, but then you go into the closet and you see Charmin, right, which is more of a premium brand. It's perfectly okay, to call people out on that and have them explain it to you. So just generally some, really broad best practices for ethnography. Highly, highly effective technique. You've got, different ways to fill your bucket when you're doing innovation. You've got internal sources of ideas, you have open innovation, and you've got voice of customer. And you saw from the study that the VOC techniques, any way that you can engage the customer or the end user or the consumer in some kind of methodology to understand their needs, to engage them in idea generation, engage them in concept building and screening, that they can be far more effective techniques than other sources of ideas, and they can be used regardless of the innovation assignment, right? You can use ethnography and other VOC techniques if you're looking for new-to-world types of products, or if you're looking to fill your pipeline with new-to-company, or substantive changes to any existing products, or just incremental changes. So understanding, again, like the scope of the assignment is really important. But for the cost and complexity of doing ethnography, most companies are going to use them for the new-to-world and new-to-company. And they are probably one of the best techniques for really identifying those key insights and those unarticulated needs that are not always going to surface in traditional qualitative research like focus groups or one-on-one interviews. So lots and lots to consider for ethnography. I'd love to be able to discuss this with you more. So if you'd like a personal review of this information and some case studies, contact me at the email address there, and then or just give me a ring at the phone number that you see listed there. So again, thank you for your interest in our ethnography best practices, and hope to work with you someday soon.